Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. Today I'm going to be talking about repressive desublimation, which is a concept that I touched upon in my previous 10-minute video, and I thought it might be worth explaining in a little bit more detail. Thank you to everybody who watched the video. Oh, by the way, I have an announcement to make, which is that together with Jeneline, we've decided to make the complete ebook archives available on Patreon for your reading and study enjoyment. That means that if you go to Patreon right now, you can sign up to the ebook tier and download the complete guide to Zizek volumes 1 through 8, as well as the first 2 volumes of the Guide to Hegel series. And later this week, I'm going to be releasing the 9th volume in the Zizek series titled Death Drive Marxism, just making some final edits to that text. So this has been a long time coming. It's been 3 years of producing these study guides, these short ebooks, and I'm really happy to release them for you. And when I look back on them, I see a lot of things I wish I would have done differently, but I guess that's the whole point of moving on and moving forward to the next one. So thank you to the patrons who continue to support this project. Okay, let's begin. Repressive desublimation. That is going to be the theme of this small, short lecture. And there's basically 2 ways to explain repressive desublimation. As some of you guys pointed out in the comment section yesterday, it is also an idea elaborated by Marcuse, as well as an idea that is originally formulated by Adorno. Although if we're being precise here, the first person to articulate a theory of desublimation would be Freud. And so what I'm going to try to do here is explain the relationship between the Freudian theory of sublimation, how that then relates to Adorno's conceptualization of repressive desublimation, which he characterizes as one of the contemporary symptoms of post-liberal ideology, namely late-stage capitalist ideology. I'll briefly talk about the Marcusean conception of repressive desublimation, which is perhaps the easiest one to understand because it presents a generalization of sorts. And then if we have time, I'd like to briefly talk about how Zizek adapts this idea. And then hopefully next week, we can talk about how Zizek brings Lacan into the equation to quite radically restructure the Freudian Adornian argument. In fact, I think it's important to emphasize that Zizek's position is not the same as that of Adorno, but it's certainly a key influence for Zizek. In fact, what we're going to be doing starting today is I'm essentially launching a new series. It's going to be a 3-month series where we're going to really dive deeply into Zizek's critique of ideology, something which I've covered before in previous lectures, but I've never really fleshed it out over the course of 3 months, really digging into the nitty-gritty of the influences, which I'd like to start doing today. Okay, let's begin. So perhaps the best way to begin talking about repressive desublimation, and greetings, by the way, greetings to everyone joining from around the world. It makes me exceedingly happy knowing that we're sharing this philosophical space. I'm in Eastern Washington currently. Hello from Boston. I see you guys and I'm so grateful to have you here. The live stream lectures are really the foundation, the core of this project. They mean everything to me. Hello, New York. I see you as well. Okay, so repressive desublimation. You know, I was going to start with Freud and then go to Adorno and then Marcuse, but let's actually briefly start with the Marcusean definition because it is the most accessible, and then we can flesh it out a bit more. Marcuse's argument in The One-Dimensional Man is essentially that we are all conformists, that we live in a society that rewards conformity, and that even when we create art or poetry or literature or cinema, we nevertheless conform both to the structural mechanisms of the industry that promotes them, as well as to the cultural commodification of the art, and perhaps finally to the tastes of the tastemakers and the audiences. Which is to say that we anticipate in advance how we create things, how we do things, and that this creates a sense of conformity, that movies start looking the same, music starts sounding the same, books start reading the same, etc. And so Marcuse's argument is that this represents repressive desublimation, which is to say that we repress the way in which we originally wanted to do something so as to make it more marketable, to make it more appealing to a mass audience. Therefore, we are one-dimensional in our dreams, in our pursuits, and we create one-dimensional art, essentially. Even our speech becomes one-dimensional. We start talking like other people, etc. And so creativity becomes repressed. That's the essential gist of Marcuse's argument about repressive desublimation. And of course, to a certain extent, it's true and it's accessible. I think it's relatable. It takes a certain amount of courage to do something that goes against the grain of people's expectations, something which isn't immediately self-evident and popular. But at the same time, Marcuse is taking away, to my mind, some of the most radical and interesting parts of Adorno's theory of repressive desublimation. In fact, whilst I'm not anti-Marcusian, I do think that he generally tends to do the very thing that he is against, which is to say, he takes a very difficult theory, an inaccessible theory in practice and tradition, namely that of the Frankfurt School and critical theory, and he makes it more accessible to the masses, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but my personal theory is that the reason that Marcuse is interested in the idea of repressive desublimation and the one-dimensionality of thought and art and practice is because he himself was suffering from this awareness that in order to reach a broader audience and in order to reach a broader student audience, he was essentially watering down his own work. It's something that I think about all the time. As you know, the slogan, if you will, of this channel is how to make philosophy accessible without dumbing it down, how to make it something that we can connect across the world without simplifying the richness of the tradition and the critical approaches. Okay, so now that you know what the Marcusian definition of repressive desublimation is, let's go all the way back to Freud. Good old Freud. Freud, in order to understand Freud's idea of sublimation, you have to understand the basic mechanisms of the relationship between the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is essentially the representative of pure desire or enjoyment, things that you want to do, to simplify it somewhat. Whereas the superego is the agent of, if you will, repression, which is to say, it's what you ought to do. And the traditional romantic motif is that we have the devil on one shoulder, the id, and the angel on the other, the superego. And the superego essentially cautions the ego and tells him what to do and not to give in to his bodily desires. For Freud, the central gambit, the point of psychoanalysis, is not for the ego to simply triumph over the id on behalf of the superego, which would be a form of Victorian morality. Instead, it's about, in a sense, educating or liberating, emancipating the ego as to this very structure, as to how repression works itself. Which is to say, for Freud, the emancipation of the ego is becoming conscious as to how the unconscious is structured. And as Lacan would later add, in his structuralist way, how the unconscious is structured like a language, but that's for a completely different lecture. The point, therefore, for Freud is that when we're confronted with the id, with our urges, that we essentially have to repress them. And if we repress them in a negative sense, they're simply buried, if you will. They result in neurotic behaviors whereby we're trying to repress something that we have disavowed. For example, you start scratching yourself because there's something that you haven't acknowledged towards yourself, something that you have repressed. However, for Freud, repression can also be a positive thing. And if you will, positive repression is what Freud calls sublimation. Sublimation, which is a Hegelian term, being the process by which the id essentially becomes negated and yet universalized into the superego. And the inspiration that Freud has for this is a story by Heinrich Heine about a man who, when he's a child, like when he's a young man, is a bit of a sadist, and he enjoys chopping off the tails of dogs. It's a horrible thing to do, of course. And instead of becoming a psychopath, instead of becoming like a serial killer or something, he grows up and he realizes that his destructive urge to mutilate animals can actually be put into a positive framework, and he becomes a surgeon. Now he can practice mutilation of bodies in a socially accepted way. It's, of course, a somewhat morbidly ironic story how the child who enjoys the taboo practice of inflicting harm upon animals realizes that he can be rewarded in society for inflicting quote unquote harm upon bodies by means of surgery so as to save them. Here we have a beautiful example of sublimation. It's not just that he's able to repress his urges to mutilate animals by means of becoming a surgeon, it's that his very urge to do the mutilation becomes the very thing which allows him to help people. And in other words, it's not simply that the demon, the devil, has been repressed by the angel. It's that the angel is the demon in a sublimated disguise, as it were. And so Freud reads this story by Heinrich Heine, and he has an idea about sublimation, which is sublimation is the process by which the id is transferred upon and sublated into a superego imperative. And if you want to put it in a very simplified way, in a more clinical way, it's essentially how you can take your negative impulses and turn them into positive ones. But of course, Freud doesn't really think of it in those terms. Like, he's not a moralizing thinker. In fact, Freud's entire psychoanalysis is about going against the moralizing tendencies of Victorian morality. As I said in the 10-minute video, the image of the devil on one side and the angel on the other, and that man therefore has to be the civilized agent who represses successfully the demon so as to work on behalf of the angel, is a form of Victorian morality that closely that supplements, if you will, the ideological framework of empire and how white Enlightenment man is inherently superior to the racially inferior other, who thereby becomes both a problem, a burden, as well as a responsibility, the burden of the white man's responsibility towards the exploitation, reified as the enlightenment of the racial other. And Freud is aware of this to a certain extent. And so Freud's entire theory of the unconscious is about liberating or emancipating the ego from this moralizing Victorian tendency, in which the ego is relegated to the position of the mediator between the id on behalf of the superego. This means that for Freud, sublation is a form of repression, except you could characterize it as positive repression, if you will. It's how we take the id and we transform it into a positive superego participation in the social order, etc. And yet, as you saw with the Heinrich Heine story, it's also a dialectical sublation, which is to say, it's not simply that the superego is the opposite of the id, it's that the id essentially morphs into an acceptable version on behalf of the superego. The child who enjoys cutting off the tails of the dogs now becomes the surgeon who benefits humanity by means of mutilating bodies in the hospital. Although mutilating might be too dramatic of a word. Now that we know the basic idea of sublimation, we can start understanding what we mean by repressive desublimation. So first of all, what is desublimation? For Freud, the purpose of psychoanalysis is essentially to desublimate the ego, to make the ego conscious of itself, to make it no longer dependent on the structural overdetermination of the id and the superego. Which is to say, if you were to have a psychoanalytic session with said surgeon, Freud would be able to make him aware of the fact how his being a surgeon is a sublimation of his childhood sadism. This means that the consciousness as to the repressive agency of his self becomes emancipating, it becomes liberating. It's like as soon as you know it, it loses its power over you. This is, I think, a central principle across psychoanalysis, which is that in the same way that there's a power to a name, there's a power to naming something, and that as soon as you have named or acknowledged something, in a sense, it's already lost its power over you. Even in clinical psychology, we see remnants or traces of this. The idea that the first step towards being cured is to admit that you have a problem, right? And for Freud, desublimation is therefore the process by which the ego is emancipated from repression, even, and this is perhaps crucial, from positive repression, namely sublimation, hence why it's desublimation. It's a process or an event of truth by which the ego starts to understand the formal or structural conditions by which the id and the the id and the superego are constitutive to the ego. This means that, strictly speaking, we have here a de-psychologizing tendency, which is to say that Freud's basic position is that psychoanalysis would be complete at the exact moment that it is no longer needed. The ego would be emancipated at the exact point in which it would no longer, in a sense, be overdetermined by repression. And here we have actually an affinity, I think, between psychoanalysis in a Freudian way and socialism or Marxism, as well as if you will, even Christianity, which is to say that, like psychoanalysis, which would, in a sense, only be successful were it no longer necessary, socialism and Marxism isn't about the positing of a future utopia, of an alternative model. Instead, at the exact moment at which Marxism unfolds its historically determined process, as it were, it would no longer be necessary. It would be obsolete. Hence why Marx argues that the point isn't to provide for more rights for the worker, but for the worker to emancipate himself from being a worker. Which is to say that for Marx, the working class is the only unnatural class. Which is to say that the point isn't to emancipate the working class so that it can rise up the ranks, it's to eliminate the working class in and of itself. Hence why a successful revolution wouldn't imply the triumph of the working class, but paradoxically the elimination of the necessity of a working class. Its success would, in a sense, lead it to disappear. The same is true for Christianity. The idea of the kingdom of heaven would mean that we no longer need to ascend into heaven and leave behind our mortal coils. It's that heaven would already be here. It would already be actualized. Therefore, the entire transcendental binary of the Old Testament would fall away. In fact, in a sense, you could make the argument that the New Testament already accomplishes this, at least in a textual sense. We can talk more about this idea because I think it's quite rich, but perhaps there's not enough time to develop that more today. So all you have to know is that desublimation for Freud is akin or is the same, equals the liberation or emancipation of the ego from sublimation. Sublimation being the process by which drives on the level of the id are sublimated into higher participation, into superego imperatives, as it were. You take something base and you turn it into something lofty, something useful or productive. And now you can kind of see what repressive desublimation would be. So repressive desublimation is the process by which the subject is promised liberation, i.e. desublimation, and yet the very process of his liberation occurs under the auspices or in the guise of his enslavement. The Nietzschean maxim, once again, that the easiest way to enslave somebody is to convince them that they are free, holds true for repressive desublimation. Repressive desublimation is how the subject is told that he is free, and yet it is precisely in this very freedom that he remains repressed, which for Marx is called alienation, which is closely affiliated to the Freudian theory of repression. So here we have the basic terms, the terminology, and I'll lay them out for you one more time, and then I can explain a bit more what Adorno's position is. And thank you for your attention. I know this is a lot. Freud has the id, namely the representative of pure desire, and the superego, the representative of repression, which can also be social repression, but most of all, it's the difference between what you want to do and what you ought to do. Freud's wager is that we must liberate the ego who exists in between. Traditionally, in Victorian morality, the idea was that the ego mediates between the id and the superego, which is to say that he represses the id on behalf of the superego. This is the classic literary motif of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Everyone has in them a monster and an enlightened human being. You have to repress the monster so as to be the enlightened human being. And we see versions of this Victorian conservative morality even resurfacing in contemporary takes by, like, let's say Jordan Peterson, etc., who argues that, you know, you have to embrace your inner dark side and your warrior, etc., blah, blah, blah. But this leaves behind the entire the entire tradition emerging out of this psychoanalysis, and as conveniently irregards Freud and Marx and anything, but who cares? So we have the id, we have the ego, we have the superego. And Freud argues that most psychological functioning is repressive, which is to say we repress the id, and this leads us into neurotic behavior. We've not acknowledged an inner truth or need or desire. For example, there's a great profile in the New Yorker recently where Judith Butler was interviewed. A very generous, I think, profile, very interesting, in which she talked about, as a young person, facing her own sexual identity and being confused and repressed about it, and that she would be scratching herself, and that she didn't know why. It was essentially a neurotic behavior of an unacknowledged desire that she had, that she knew that she knew there to be a prohibition against. And that she spoke to someone who essentially talked to her about the how in Christianity and in the Bible, there's the idea of the hair shirt that is worn to essentially get rid of sin, a scratchy shirt. And she realized it was the first time that she understood that you could read a text as literature, that you could read the Bible as literature, and that you could therefore read a metaphor as a symptom. This is her initial awareness of theory and psychoanalysis, in a sense, and its central project. And not only did she understand that, but in understanding it, she emancipated herself. She suddenly realized why she was scratching, and therefore she no longer wanted to scratch herself. Here we have what Marx would call desublimation. We have the process by which the sublimating act of either negative repression through neurosis or positive repression, namely being able to function in society as a positive agent of participation, both these positions are desublimated on behalf of the emancipation of the subject's own understanding as to their symptom. This means that the Freudian point or purpose of psychoanalysis is to achieve this self-consciousness, thereby desublimating the subject from sublimation of the id into the superego. Repressive desublimation, as I said before, is how this very goal is brought to you, liberation, emancipation, under the guise of its exact opposite. And this is where Adorno comes in. Adorno argues that repressive desublimation is the central characteristic of capitalist societies, which is to say the capitalist imperative is you should give in to your desires. You should turn your desires, your id, into a superego injunction. Think, for example, about Nike's famous slogan, "Just do it." Here we have the exact opposite of Victorian morality. Victorian morality would be, don't do it. Don't give in to your desires. Whereas the capitalist imperative is, just do it. Don't think about whether or not you should take out that loan. Just take out that loan so that you can buy these new sneakers. Don't think about whether or not you're promoting abhorrent labor practices around the world. Just buy the goddamn sneakers. Don't think about whether or not you're working a dead-end job and you're wearing sneakers to be like Mike, even though you're a sad old, I don't know, not basketball playing person. Buy the sneakers. The capitalist imperative, just do it. Or, as Zizek likes to put it, enjoy yourself, presents us with what appears to be an embrace of the id, and yet this very embrace, this very emancipation or release of the subject occurs under the guise of the oppression of the superego. Namely, you are giving into your desires so as to further the capitalist system of exploitation. And this means that within capitalism, the goal of psychoanalysis is supposedly reached. Namely, the subject can be free from repression. He no longer suffers from neurosis because now he can give in to his desires and be emancipated and happy all the time. And yet, of course, the opposite is true. It's not that we want to give in to our id. This doesn't make us happy. This only makes us more repressed. This makes us more neurotic. We're incapable of really enjoying. We're told what to desire and how to be happy. And we look at other people and we imagine themselves to be happy. We imagine them to be happy in a way that we can't be ourselves. We become more alienated. We become more depressed. We're not in any way emancipated. Nominally, we are free to consume, free to participate within the consumer economy, free to exploit other people by acquiring properties and asking them to pay rent for it, etc. And yet, fundamentally, we are no closer to actual self-consciousness or actual liberation than we were in a Victorian society. In fact, Adorno's basic point is that the oppressive system of Victorian morality, which was the ideological supplement to the world of empire, is now simply universalized to the Western subject as well. The Western subject who is supposedly free to act upon his desire, yet who nevertheless remains constitutively repressed within capitalist exploitation. Except now he's not simply being overtly oppressed, the oppression has been outsourced to himself. He must discipline himself so as to be an effective worker contributing to the capitalist incentive structure. And here you can see how Marcuse essentially takes this quite technical and theoretical argument from Theodor Adorno about repressive desublimation and generalizes it and makes it more accessible, which is to say, Marcuse's argument is that we become one-dimensional and we produce one-dimensional art, which is to say, we anticipate in advance how our very speech and how our creativity and indeed our work becomes commodified, and therefore we try to make it suitably accessible to a mass audience. This means that the commodification of language and art and imagination reflects, and indeed in Marxist terms reifies, the commodification of subjectivity. We become one-dimensional. We dream one-dimensional dreams. We live one-dimensional lives. And this is what Marcuse characterizes as repressive desublimation, namely the process by which our supposed and very freedom is the agent of our oppression. And hopefully you can see now how these ideas relate to each other, which is to say the Freudian theory of repression has negative repression, which is neurotic behavior, and positive repression, which is sublimation of the id into superego participation. This then leads Freud to articulate that the goal or the purpose of psychoanalysis is the emancipation of the ego, which is to say the desublimation of the id's sublimation into superego injunction. Hence why, for Adorno, under capitalism, this supposed liberation of the id, rather than emancipating the subject, further entraps the subject within the superego injunction, the social imperative of capitalist participation. And how how Marcuse then takes this argument and makes it even more accessible by essentially arguing that we become one-dimensional and we live one-dimensional lives. And I think what's important to see here is that we are essentially making a leap from a Freudian psychoanalysis towards an Adornian critical theory, which is an appropriation, if you will, of psychoanalysis in a very specific way, in a Marxist way, in a way that suits the lens of critical theory. But this is, in a sense, implicit already within psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis, by means of, or Freudian psychoanalysis, by means of being interested in repression and symptomatic behavior, is therefore inherently already a political project. It's about the way in which societal norms and expectations structure our own consciousness. And this means that psychoanalysis inherently becomes a demystifying practice, a practice of trying to take consciousness out of repression, out of obscurity. And therefore, in a sense, it becomes linked by Adorno to the critique of ideology. And ideology, in a Marxist sense, is simply how unnatural behavior is made to be seen as natural. But we can cover that in another lecture. I'd like to conclude here briefly by bringing Zizek into the equation. After all, this is a lecture series on Zizek. Zizek's contribution to this process, from Freud to Adorno to Marcuse, is essentially to contribute a Lacanian problematization or radicalization of the Freudian wager, which is to say the Lacanian approach demystifies the very Freudian formalism of id, superego, and the ego stuck in between. And what I'd like to do in the next lecture is to talk about how Zizek uses Lacan to argue both for and against Adorno and both for and against Freud, to, in a sense, show their limitations, but to also take them to the next level. That will be next week's lecture. Until then, if you'd like to learn more, you can download, as I said before, my Complete Guide to Zizek series on Patreon. Thank you to the patrons who allow me to keep hosting these very niche lectures. I think we can all agree on that. It brings me immense joy to be here with you today, and I hope that you have a wonderful week. That is my short explanation of repressive desublimation. I will see you soon. And if you'd like to join me for the seminar, that will be starting in half an hour on Discord, where I will answer your questions. See you soon, and thank you for watching.